Okay, so I've been looking for new content to react to, and not only to react to, but new content to actually make. I would like eventually to start making my own videos that's outside of the music spectrum. I'm not stopping the music reactions, but I will be slowing those down quite a bit for obvious reasons, because 99% of them get claimed, and it really does become a bit of a waste of time when most of your content is being claimed, and it's not a viable sort of content base to stay on. So I'd like to sort of adapt and shift towards other content and then start creating content which is my own. And when I do that, I would love to follow this creator's sort of recipe, because I think he's unbelievably fascinating and he does content on such interesting stuff based on case studies, and it's just brilliant educational stuff. His name is Johnny Harris. He's won many awards for his work as a content creator, and he used to work for The Telegraph. Brilliant creator. I haven't watched a lot of his stuff. I've only just recently found him. I've watched 3 or 4 of his videos, but I find him fascinating, and I thought we could watch him together, react to some of his stuff together, and eventually through my journey I'm going to get to a point where I can actually, hopefully inspired by him, start creating content much like this. So you guys let me know what you think of this type of content down below. This one is called How the US Stole the Middle East. I have not seen this, I haven't watched anything. He's got a series on this kind of thing. He's got one with Iraq as well, which we'll get to. And I'd love to see what this is about. So let's get straight into it, man. Johnny Harris, How the US Stole the Middle East. Let's go. It's a little bit long, but it's very interesting stuff. Let's go.
The Middle East, the part of Asia that Europeans see as the middle of what they see as the East. Sort of arbitrary. Whatever. We call it the Middle East. This part of the world is literally where civilization started. Right here in modern-day Iraq. And over the years, the borders here have been redrawn many times as empires have ebbed and flowed through this region. By the way, I didn't make this time-lapse. A very talented YouTuber did, and he deserves a medal for it. Or perhaps just a
shots him out.
Thanks, man. Anyway, the most recent carving up of this region happened by European powers. The French, the British, the Russians. I mean, are we surprised? No. Like, of course it was the British. Of course it was the French. Of course it was Europeans. Of course. The lines they drew didn't really take into account language or ethnicity or regional identity. They just sort of sliced it all up amongst themselves and said, these are our new regions of power in the Middle East. Eventually those European powers left, but the lines they drew stuck around and became the skeleton for what the borders look like today. And this is where our story starts. In the 1930s, here in the modern Middle East. At this point, across the ocean, there was this growing superpower that had spent the last century moving west, taking over this whole continent and beyond deep into the Pacific Ocean. We've talked about that a bit. But things were changing. The world had just fought a brutal world war that was fought with new weapons that were powered by this new important substance, oil. Germany lost that war, in part because they didn't have access to enough oil to keep up with this new style of warfare that relied a lot more on machines.
So like America, in terms of their power and their hegemony, in terms of how they got so powerful, World War II was a major factor of that because of their involvement, because of how quickly they ramped up in... the thing about America is that they've always had the economic might, and their economic might translated into military might, translated into production might, and what happened is they, in World War II, when they ramped up production and pretty much turned all of their manufacturing into their manufacturing companies and plants into manufacturing weapons for World War II, they immediately took that as a sign of, oh wait, this is actually an opportunity to become so powerful, to become a hegemony that is so much bigger and greater than everything else. That it would set US on a course of being the greatest superpower and eventually becoming the world police. For better or for worse, when they did that, obviously there was lots of complications that came after that. But it's not something that any other superpower wouldn't have done. Superpowers tend to be the bullies, tend to hold the bigger stick. And if they can, sort of gain world dominance in a way, whether it be economically or whether it be militarily, they're going to do that. America went down the economic sense, which then translated into the whole military complex as well, and started putting like military bases all over the world. But World War II was basically the catalyst for the USA, just springboarding into being the world's superpower as they are today.
Machines. The young superpower realized that access to this stuff would determine who would be powerful and who would not. So they stopped looking west for a moment and turned east, with hopes of finding the fuel they needed to build their power. The US presence in the Middle East started with one little dot, right here. But soon that dot would expand into a sprawling network of alliances, covert attacks, flows of weapons, money, and the building of innumerable bases, and eventually turning into full-on ground wars. This is how the US stole the Middle East.
Ready and willing to employ all means necessary.
Okay, so it's the 1930s, and the US doesn't have a significant presence in the Middle East at this point. But that's about to change, because there's a company based in California that wants to explore this vast desert for oil.
11,000 miles from San Francisco, there lies a primeval desert, a mass of drifting sand and sun-baked earth, 1/3 the size of the United States.
The liquid gold.
This was sort of a risky decision for the California company because, first off, they had no idea if there was actually any oil here.
They knew it would mean sinking into the desert the money of thousands of stockholders in a project that might well end in complete loss.
And second off, this desert was a part of a very hardcore religious kingdom.
The fact that Mecca is the source and the shrine of Islam gives Saudi Arabia a central place in the Islamic and therefore the Arab world.
That was home to the holiest sites in Islam, run by a dogmatic royal family that did not like outsiders, especially non-believing Westerners. But even still, the king of the Desert Kingdom eventually gives the California company permission to explore almost 1 million square kilometers of this desert looking for oil.
And I wonder, why is that? Why did the king eventually say, you know what, you can do that? Why? Because the United States had the technology to dig and drill for that oil. And again, all translated to money. Money. People will sell their souls for money. So they actually gave, they had a crack in the wall. The United States had a crack in the wall and decided to exploit that. And they were very good with the manipulation game, specifically on the the negotiation side. For those of you who haven't read, I'd suggest you read a book called Economic Hitman. I forget the whole damn name. Oh, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I suggest you read that book. It's actually quite an enlightening book. America is damn good at this, man. They own the playbook at sort of going into countries and manipulating to get their way. Anyway, carrying on, right? A lot of people gave in to them, right? Why? Because money. America spoke in the language of green, green money, how we can make you wealthy beyond your dreams, and people gave into that.
And after a few years, the bet paid off, and on March 3rd, 1938, in this little patch of coastal desert, they struck gold. Well, actually they struck oil, but it might as well have been gold.
Yeah.
So throughout the 30s and 40s, American oil executives, workers, and their families started flocking to the Middle East, establishing the first significant American presence in the region. They set up little cities around the oil operation that were little slices of America, full of the deepest sinful behavior, like allowing women to drive and the consumption of alcohol.
I was actually just about to say that. I was about to say, could you imagine now? I mean, they didn't really see the ramifications specifically, as it's an Arabic nation that have got their own sort of values and morals, and are not as tolerant as the Western world. And now here they go, and they've opened up this sort of opportunity for the United States to ship in there and sort of strike oil so they could make some money. But now all of these companies that are coming in there obviously need to bring their families because they've been there for a long time. And with it comes their traditions. With it comes their ideologies and things like that. And they go there, and the women can drive because they're free. The people are drinking alcohol. So like this whole freedom and tolerant society that's now coming into they're encroaching on a society that is not as tolerant and has their own morals and values and their own way of living. And now this starts becoming a major problem for them, which you can kind of see lays down the map for the hatred between the West and the Middle East right here. I did not know this about this, so it's actually quite interesting. Again, let's carry on.
Full of the deepest sinful behavior, like allowing women to drive and the consumption of alcohol.
Here is another American colony, complete with air-conditioned houses, 2 hospitals, and an outdoor movie theater.
This is the sort of stuff that is very off limits in Saudi Arabia. It's literally illegal at this point. So you have a lot of Saudis who are not happy about their government letting the Americans in to behave however they want.
Money.
But the oil kept flowing. And soon the US government goes to the royal family and says, listen, the oil is flowing better than ever. This is awesome. How about we build a little military base attached to our little oil city so that we can, protect you and protect us and protect the oil and stuff.
Just a little one. Just a little military base. Not like a big military base. Just a little one. It's going to have a couple of, vehicles, Humvees and things like that. And, every year we'll do a couple of updates and, we'll put some missiles and, don't sweat about it, man. It's just here to protect the oil, man. It's just here to protect the oil. It's here to protect. It's good for you guys. It's good for you guys.
Military base attached to our little oil city so that we can, protect you and protect us and protect the oil and stuff. And the Saudis are like, okay, having the great Satan come to our country for oil is one thing, but letting them set up a full-on military base on our soil, and especially when everyone in our country is not happy with their presence in the first place. But, said the royal family, all of this oil
getting rich.
is really valuable and it's really nice and we're getting super rich. So they're like, yeah, sure, set up the base. But there was one stipulation that the Saudis had for the Americans. You are not allowed to literally plant a flag, no flagpoles of the United States. You cannot put your flag anywhere on this base. Instead, you can put a little plaque on the side of the building so that your flag is not literally on our soil. And that was the deal. And that's exactly what happened. The US sets up its...
You think about that in terms of a compromise, in terms of selling out your people as well. In the sense, it's we don't really want to say no because the money is flowing and we don't really want to, even though we don't like these hedonistic people that are coming to our country and doing this, but money is obviously more important. So here's a compromise. Don't put a flag up, right? Just so that we can have the whole smoke and mirrors thing so that our people don't see the United States is here, kind of taking over, and why is there military, like a US military base here? So it's kind of put a little plaque because no one can really see that from a distance, right? And no one's really going to come up to the military base to read that plaque. And that's a good enough concession. If you do that, no flag, carry on doing your thing. I mean, wow, let's go.
First military operation in the Middle East in the form of a landing strip that is right next to this oil field. Okay, so all of this infrastructure that the Americans were building required someone to build it. They needed a construction company. And there was one construction company that the Americans really liked that helped them build their oil city and their base. This company was founded and run by a guy named Mohammed. Now listen, do you think I'm really giving you the backstory on the construction company that built the air base in the oil city just because that's interesting and I like to talk about construction? No, this is actually very relevant to the story, and you will see why very soon. So the Americans and the Saudis are having this forbidden oil bromance, and it's going really well, and the oil is flowing, everyone's getting rich, and meanwhile, the rest of the Middle East is looking at Saudi Arabia and they're like, dude, WTF? Why are you in bed with America? And why are you letting them set up a landing strip in your country? And the Saudi royals are like, do you realize how rich we're getting right now? If you were in our position, you would do the same thing. Egypt. Okay, so it's the 1950s, and let's get back to Mohammed, the construction guy. His company, by this point, is thriving. The American presence in oil land is just exploding, and he is building all of the stuff for it. And so this guy has a giant business. And he starts to have children. Well, in fact, he had a lot of children, like 54 children, because he had 22 wives, because that is a thing in Saudi Arabia to this day. Anyway, the point is, one of Muhammad's sons is named Osama.
Wow, you see why it's so interesting, because you don't actually look at the backstory over here. You only get what the media gives you. You only get what's told to you on the surface. But what I love about what Johnny Harris does, he actually digs so much deeper into things like this. And he goes into like business, he goes into like case studies on these things. And he dives so deep into every topic. And he gives you the backstories of how these things started and all the other parameters that don't really get given to you. None of the surface stuff, because all the stuff is very nuanced and it goes back and there are multiple parties involved. It's not just the United States who are there. The United States go into these regions and they try and make these negotiations, and they really write the playbook on these kind of negotiations. And it comes to a point where even if they are writing the playbook and they try to do something economically, if they still get pushed aside, they will force their way in. However, that doesn't matter. I mean, I'm sure, we'll talk a little bit about the Iraqi situation probably in another video, because he does have one about Iraq where America should have just never gone there, but that's a whole different story. But there are so many different parties and no one ever looks at it this deeply. You know what I mean? It's not just that the USA went and did these things. There were other parties, willing participants in this that also sold themselves to make money. Money. That's just how the world turns, man. It's all money, and corruption. Let's go.
I told you this was going to be relevant. Okay, a reminder that Saudi Arabia is not the entire Middle East. So, I'm going to leave the Osama bin Laden cliffhanger for a moment to tell you what else was going on in the Middle East at this time. Remember that it was the hunt for oil that brought the US to Saudi Arabia originally. But now, in the 50s and 60s, there was a new reason for the US to think about the Middle East. And that reason is because there's another big superpower that has nuclear weapons, called the Soviet Union, who is coming into the region and saying to everyone, come join Team Communism. And the US is like, hold my beer. So in addition to oil, the US is now involved in trying to not let the Soviet Union have any power in this region. Over in Iran, there was a democratically elected leader that the US didn't like. They thought he was maybe a little too friendly with the Soviet Union. So they worked together with the British to literally overthrow the government of Iran so that they could install a dictatorial leader that was more friendly to the United States. Little side note here, the airport that I fly out of here in DC is named after the guy who gave the go-ahead for this coup in Iran. John Foster.
That is mad. I did not know that. And just take a look at that over here. So America has always been obviously anti-communism, which goes without saying anti-dictatorship, right? But the leader of Iran, right, who was essentially a dictator and pro sort of communism, was just, they were getting too close to the Russian communist state. They were getting too close to the USSR. So America is like, this isn't so much about the dictator, it's about which dictator, right? So if we can install one of the dictators we prefer, it doesn't matter that he's a dictator. It doesn't matter that democracy and freedom doesn't really prevail in that country, as long as we get one that cozies up closest to us. So from a moral standpoint, you know, the whole Uncle Sam freedom thing didn't quite play much of a role in this. Let's go.
Little side note here. The airport that I fly out of here in DC is named after the guy who gave the go-ahead for this coup in Iran, John Foster Dulles. So I'm reminded of the whole Iran thing every time I fly. So the US has its oil thing. It's now involved in trying to prop up a dictator in Iran. There's another big thing happening that brings the US into the region, which is that the newly declared state of Israel is starting to piss off its neighbors and starting to look to the US for support. And the US gladly offers it, seeing Israel as a friendly nation in the region that could be a big proponent of US interests. So the US starts to fund Israel with tons of money and fighter jets and all of these things to help them fight their wars against their Arab neighbors. There was a debate happening in the United States on whether or not they should actually do all of this to support Israel so intensely, because they knew if they did, they were going to piss off all of the neighbors in the Middle East. And all of the neighbors are the ones who had the oil. In the end, the US did decide to support Israel. And with that came a major backlash from all of these oil-producing countries in the neighborhood.
It's a crisis of such proportion that we probably haven't even begun to grasp it yet as far as the country is concerned.
Scenes like this are becoming all too common on both sides of the Atlantic. But for America, they are more ominous. They tell the Arabs that their oil weapon is wounding America, the country that supports and supplies their enemy Israel.
It's actually quite amazing to see these energy wars that are happening. It's not just like right now what is currently happening, with Russia and Ukraine and the whole energy situation that the West finds itself in. The energy has always been used as a weapon, even going back to like the 1950s and even before then. You're going to use the most strike, and what's going to hit the biggest blow to a society is its energy and its energy sort of capacity and independence. So even then at the time, America sort of, stepping away from these kind of things and supporting a country like Israel, then energy was used as and oil was used as a weapon which then also plunged the USA into a whole bunch of energy and oil issues, which skyrocketed gas prices and things like that, which is crazy just in terms of how these politicians just take ordinary people and smaller countries, they wield their power and just play with people's lives in order to sort of wield their political power for their own interests, which is, it's nothing new. It's not just happening in in 2022. It's been happening in the 20th century and long before then.
Eventually, this backlash against supporting Israel kind of calmed down. There was some peace talks. And anyway, let's get back to Mohammed, the construction guy, and his son Osama, because this is where it really starts to heat up.
And it is this world of religious authority and deeply rooted traditions that is now being challenged by the wealth of oil and the Western invasion it has brought.
So it's now the 70s, and Mohammed bin Laden, the construction guy, is now insanely rich. His construction company is giant, his 54 children are also rich, and his son Osama is growing up and is in his 20s and is looking around at all of this stuff happening in Iran and in Israel and is starting to feel really uncomfortable with the notion of his family being so supportive of American presence in the Middle East and his government, this religious kingdom, home of Mecca and Medina, being so okay with the US so embedded in the Middle East at this point. These are ancient, holy lands. Why is my government and my family supporting this great Satan superpower coming in and becoming so involved in the Middle East? So bin Laden sets out on a lifelong quest to fight back against these superpowers, not just the US, but also the Soviet Union, invading the Middle East. He heads to Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union is invading Afghanistan, trying to take it over.
Now, I bet you did not know that backstory on Osama bin Laden. I didn't even know that. All we were actually told is that he was a terrorist. He had to, he caused 9/11, which was an absolute travesty. But no one really goes into the backstory in terms of how he came up and what was his uprising, and the fact that the US over the years, even not now what he's talking about now, just over the years, he was also funded, and a lot of terrorist groups were funded by the USA and given arms and things like that. But that is a discussion for another video. But it's interesting to see the backstory to all of these things.
Bin Laden wants to fight back. By the way, the same year in Iran, that dictator that the US put in gets overthrown in a giant religious revolution that gets rid of the old dictator that the US liked and puts in a religious government headed by this guy, Ayatollah Khomeini. This new government takes a bunch of Americans hostage and starts off hating the United States. And I mean, can you blame them? If someone overthrew the person I elected, I would be pretty pissed too. So anyway, back to bin Laden. He arrives to Afghanistan with a few things. Number one, a bunch of money. Remember, his family's like super rich. He also comes with construction infrastructure because he's like a construction guy. Like his family knows construction and infrastructure building. But most importantly, he comes with an obsessive dedication to fighting back against any superpower that is invading the Middle East. So Osama joins in with all of these rebel fighters who are fighting back against the Soviet Union, and they fight a long, brutal war. By the way, the US was secretly loving this, loving that the Soviet Union was getting like beat back by these like rebel fighters. So they end up sending...
Isn't that like a common thing in terms of US and their proxy wars? Right? I feel like the US military concept, obviously, look, wars make money at the end of the day. Economically, it just absolutely props up an economy. It's sad, right? And there's a thing that, people say money runs the world. It's actually not exactly that. There's actually a song by, I think it's a Carla, it says, or Loki, I'm not entirely sure, murder runs the globe, right? All of this kind of thing, or wars is what actually runs the world, right? It's this idea of power. It's this idea of being the global hegemony. And that all comes through, the transfer of weapons, the transfer of money, fighting these proxy wars, like, America going head to head with a nuclear power is always a touch and go sort of subject. And it's always, you can't really do that specifically in today's day and age of nuclear weapons. Even when they fought the Cold War against Russia, they had to tread super lightly because, it comes to a point where all the Cuban Missile Crisis at a certain point threatened the world and humanity as it is. So they kind of like sort of sit back and be like, actually, let's fund these proxy wars and let's provide as much weaponry and things under the Lend-Lease Act, where we can just give weaponry and things like that and money, because eventually down the line it's all going to come back our way. You know what I mean? So that's just the strategy
loads
of all
of
superpowers.
Weapons and money and support to these fighters, something that will come back to bite them a few decades later. Eventually, Osama and the Afghan fighters beat back the Soviet Union. It was 10 brutal years of war, and by the end, these fighters were battle-hardened. Osama was now completely dedicated to his cause of fighting back against superpowers who were coming into the Middle East. So he returns back to Saudi Arabia, where he starts raising money and awareness for his new group that he started while he was in Afghanistan. It's called Al-Qaeda. And the mission of the group is to protect Islam through violently striking back against big superpowers coming into the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia's like, Osama, like, do you have to do this, dude? Do you realize how rich we're getting? Like, Saudi princes are living on yachts in the south of France and, like, flying in their private jets. And they're like, dude, chill. Like, it's fine. We get it. We don't like the United States.
It's crazy to think that America still has that sort of cozy relationship with the Saudi prince and Saudi Arabia. So obviously you can see that this goes way back and for a reason, and all down to money. Essentially, even today, where I know it's kind of like it's a bit of a it's a relationship that's kind of on a fine line, on a fine thread, specifically with this administration, with Joe Biden. First, he called them a pariah state after the murder of that one journalist, which I cannot remember. Joe Biden took the moral high ground, which was correct, saying that, you don't just do that. You don't just butcher journalists because you don't like what they say. But then as he gets into power, he goes, hand in hat in hand, to like beg for oil from Saudi Arabia. Do you know what I mean? It just goes to show you that all politicians, it's not just one from a political side or one from a different political party. All politicians have to acquiesce to the corporate lobbyists that say, you have to do this at the end of the day. So they actually, American politicians are, in a sense, like puppets, because they just completely lobbied by corporates and sort of corporate interests. So they say, this is what you have to do. If you're not going to drill, you're going to have to go and, hat in hand to these guys and say, well, you're going to have to drop your morals and your values, essentially. So when they're campaigning, they always have the highest of values, the highest of morals. But when they're in power, they don't give a fuck, man. They just do what the corporate elites and what the corporate complex and the military complex wants them to do, and they have zero say in it, right? And they'll fall in line because it's beneficial to them, and it's beneficial to their interests, and it's beneficial to to their stay in power, so if the people don't really make a difference and their morals and virtues don't really make a difference, welcome to the world of politicians. Let's go.
States, but like, can you like maybe chill? Our partnership with the United States is actually turning out to be really great, and I know, yeah, they're really into Israel and they're really bad and everything, but like, they buy our oil and they give us weapons and we're like doing just fine over here. Osama doesn't chill, and the Saudi government eventually takes away his passport, not letting him leave, and told him to hush up with all the anti-American holy war talk. So Osama finds another plan to maybe win back the heart of the royals. Saudi Arabia has a next-door neighbor named Iraq who was run by Saddam Hussein, who Osama sees as a really bad Muslim, totally secular and brutal, and he's just like not a good guy. Saddam is also cashing in on the oil boom. He's building big palaces and statues of himself all over the country. Oh yeah, and he also used the oil money to build a giant army, like the fourth biggest in the world. With this massive army, Saddam decided that he could maybe multiply his oil reserves if he popped down to invade this little tiny country of Kuwait, where there's also loads of oil. This sort of freaked the Saudis out. If Saddam, with his giant army, could grab Kuwait, what would stop him from marching right across this desert into Saudi Arabia? So there's this moment that it's like the moment of infamy of this whole thing, where Osama goes to the Saudis and he says,
"I volunteer as tribute."
He doesn't actually say, I volunteer in tribute. That was Hunger Games.
I believe we have a volunteer.
But he effectively says, I have me and my battle-hardened men who can go in and fight against Saddam and defend the kingdom. And the Saudis are like, no, we're not gonna let this ragtag group of rebel fighters fight off the fourth largest army in the world. And Osama's like, well, we beat the Soviets. They're a big army with nuclear weapons and everything. And the Saudis are like, yeah, because you hid in the hills in caves in Afghanistan. Prince Sultan literally told bin Laden,
you can't fight an enemy that you cannot see.
Verbatim, quote, there are no caves in Kuwait. And then he asks them, what will you do when he lobs the missiles at you with chemical and biological weapons? Osama's response, we will fight them with our faith. And the Saudis are like,
yeah, no thanks.
Awkward. Sorry, dude. Instead, the king met with somebody else that he thought would make a much better fit than bin Laden and his faith fighters. Dick Cheney had flown to Saudi Arabia the day after Saddam had invaded Kuwait. At this point, the bromance between the US and Saudi Arabia had cooled a little bit, as Saudi had gotten more and more flack for being in bed with the US. But even despite this, he told Cheney to come with as much force and as quickly as he could.
It's actually amazing to see how you can actually start seeing the puzzle pieces. It's how this all starts coming together. You can almost see, you can see the whole precedent that led to America eventually invading Iraq, right? The whole backstory to all of this, right? America was literally called in to say, bring as much force as possible, bring as much as you can as possible. And America, of course, is going to be like, we got you, Saudi Arabia. Absolutely no problem. We will start shipping out now. We'll start shipping out our equipment. We'll start shipping out our money. We'll start shipping out our children to go and fight in this. What an opportunity. Let's go. Anyway, interesting. Let's go.
And that is exactly what Dick Cheney did.
Ready and willing to employ all means necessary.
The U.S. went insane here. They recruited 37 other countries, and then they sent more firepower in terms of ships and bombers and troops and all this stuff than you and I could ever imagine. It was insanity. And they totally crushed Saddam. Within a few weeks, they had pushed Saddam back and completely won over the hearts of the royals. The bromance is back in business. So now you have these Saudis that are beaming at the Americans for helping them fight off Saddam. And you have a bunch of bases that the US set up to mount this attack. Way more than before. The US came with all of this firepower and manpower and base.
Think about it. It started as just one small military base just to protect the oil. And now there's a network of new US military bases. By happenstance.
And artillery. And then they just sort of never left. Something that really pissed off a lot of Saudis who were very uncomfortable with US presence to begin with. But the guy who was most pissed off than anyone in the Middle East at this point, Osama bin Laden, who had not only been rejected by his own country, but then who got chosen instead, but the great Satan, the United States, a power that Osama had built his entire life fighting against. So Osama bin Laden starts to double down on his original mission. He leaves Saudi Arabia and begins coordinating very precise attacks that could really only be coordinated by a guy who was good at technical details of a construction company and who had lots of money to fund it. He carries out attacks against the United States.
It's actually crazy to think that, the way, the mainstream media painted Osama bin Laden. Obviously, he was a terrible human being, but I'm saying the way they painted him was as this, this sort of like 18th century droob in sandals and a head wrap. It's just this evil, ignorant person. He was actually a highly educated, highly intelligent individual, right? That obviously came from somewhere with a backstory, with a motive, because of history in the past. And we never really ever got told that. We just got told that these are just bad, radical people that want to do terrible things to the Western world. And it's not to say that they're not bad people and they're not terrible. Obviously, you can never protect such a horrendous villain like that. But sort of understanding the backstory as well goes a long way into understanding how it led to the situation in the United States in 9/11. Right, it's always, these things are super nuanced things that people need to understand there, and a lot of people just don't look into the backstories of any of this kind of thing. But it's very interesting to dig deeper.
All around the world, and by the late 90s, he starts planning the attack that would change our world forever.
We're setting up an ad hoc.
Crazy moment, this, man.
So this is just the first half of the story. What happens next is something that we're all kind of familiar with.
Yep. We all know after that, okay, so much led to, it was like a cascading, 9/11 was a cascading sort of series of events that led to a lot of like terrible things. An Afghan war that lasted for 20 years, with $1 trillion spent for absolutely nothing to give it back to the people who committed the heinous act of 9/11. And then the Iraq war that should have never happened, but the 9/11 situation and the Afghan situation kind of becomes a catalyst for the Iraqi invasion on a false precept. And then it just spirals from there. And then the Patriot Act, in the sense that United States literally signs the Patriot Act, where people's privacies are purely signed away, under the guise of security. It's mad what spiraled from 9/11. So, yeah, anyway, carry on.
In fact, I think we're all still kind of processing the US presence in the Middle East today and how that all went down. But it deserves taking a look at, and I'm not going to do that right now. I want to make a separate video for Iraq and Afghanistan,
we'll get into that one,
Israel and Iran, and dive into each of these cases to show how the US presence in the Middle East is not just about oil. In fact, oil is becoming less and less of a vital aspect of 100%. The US presence as we have alternative sources of this sort of energy. Instead, our presence in the Middle East has become a fixture of how we think about foreign policy and how we think about the map. It's become so embedded in our military doctrine and in our foreign policy doctrine that it's proving to be really hard to think about how we could ever get out.
It's unreal.
Thank you everyone for watching this video. Man, the Middle East. The Middle East.
Tough
it's a
place.
Complicated place, and this is just a very broad overview. And like I said, I want to go deeper into each of these case studies because there's so much more to cover with each of these stories. Anyway, that is to come. Stay tuned for that. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring today's video.
Okay, so I absolutely implore you to go and watch and subscribe to his channel. I mean, you don't have to watch the reaction here. You can go watch it uninterrupted. I just give, bits and pieces of my own views and thoughts on this. And I find this content so fascinating. It's so interesting. I am a huge lover of history. I'm a huge lover of like politics and political sort of doctrines and interests and ideologies like that, and powers, and why people do what they do, and why dictators do what they do, and why people who has reshaped the world did what they did. I absolutely love that, and I just thought it'd be interesting to bring this to the channel for us to watch it together. Johnny Harris is absolutely incredible. I really, really do hope that you go down to the description, click on his video, go subscribe to his channel. He's such a brilliant content creator, and I genuinely aspire to one day create content much like this, because this is so down my alley. Anyway, you guys let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you guys are in for the next series, which is the Iraq and the Israel and all that kind of vibe. And yeah, man, I love you all, man. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.